Hey y'all, in today's video I'm going to be doing a lecture analysis of Manly Hall's classic titled The Warrior's Path. And the theme of this lecture is going to be aligning a lot with a few of the recent videos I've done. One's on reincarnation and empire. One is on the role of suffering in the universal plan. And there's another one too. But we're kind of dealing with social conflict, times of war, and finding meaning and purpose in these difficult, challenging moments. So we are definitely in a time of war right now, but it's a non-traditional type of war. But what makes me say that sort of objectively, that this is a sort of deep state maneuver that's happening across the world, is the fact that in January 2020, we had a conjunction between Pluto and Saturn, and the cycle, the sort of secular relationship between Pluto and Saturn is one, if you go back into history, it correlates with World War One, World War Two, the Vietnam War. So we're going to be looking at or listening to Manly Hall go into his very thoughtful take on how we can find meaning and purpose in times like these. So I hope you enjoy. We're going to kick off with Manly Hall. Oh, actually, before we kick off, I just want to give another plug to my Atlantis zine, which is available print or digital copy on my little e-store. It's at The Wisdom Tradition, one word, .bigcartel.com. You can find it on my website, www.alexsachon.com. And also, I have a new Instagram account that I'm kind of gradually putting stuff on. So if you're on Instagram, follow me at The Wisdom Tradition, one word. So yeah, let's get going. Manly Hall's going to kick it off. He's going to give context here, talking about the Mahabharata. I hope I'm saying that right. The Indian classic, philosophical classic. He's going to tell an anecdote from that story, and then we're going to move forward. And throughout this lecture, he talks about the Pearl Harbor attack, because I think he did this lecture on one of the anniversaries of that attack, and so we'll be visiting that as a sort of case study throughout. So let's get going right now with Manly Hall.
There seems to be among Western peoples generally very little understanding of how to approach the problem of war. The West has always more or less accepted war as something that was going to happen whenever ambitious nations or ambitious leaders get into involvements. Actually, however, there has to be something about it that is a little bigger than this. There has to be some way in which war not only can be explained, but can also be eliminated. And I think the only answer we have for that at the present moment is to turn toward the East, where this problem has been given much more consideration than in Europe or America. In the Orient, there are two great structures of belief relating to war. The one is Hindu and is settled in the great Mahabharata cycle. It is a great epic, like the epics of Homer, dealing with the war of brothers, the wars that rose in ambitions and in all the confusions of hasty judgments, selfishness, ambition, avarice, and cruelty. And in this particular great work, the Mahabharata, there is a little section that has been called the soul, the Eastern equivalent to the Western Book of Psalms. This is called the Bhagavad Gita. And this is the Lord's song. And the background of it is rather interesting to our point of the morning. Prince Arjuna, the head of a great clan in India, is seated in his war chariot on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. he is faced by an army drawn up against his army. And as he looks across, he sees his own kinsmen. He sees relatives and friends of years standing, waiting to die in battle. And Arjuna is desolated by this situation. He is required by the people of his own group to defend them. He does not want to go out and kill anybody. He wants a peaceful solution to everything. Yet he must either surrender his country, destroy his culture, and enslave his people, or else he has to go forth and fight on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. And as he is in prayer, in meditation in his war chariot, before he gives the war orders, a great light suddenly surrounds the chariot. And in this light the god Krishna appears. And he takes the place of the charioteer. He sits in the chariot with the prince and recites to him the marvelous story of the Bhagavad Gita. He tells the young prince not to grieve, not to fear, and not to worry. For there's a greatness, a wholeness, and a goodness that encircles everything, no matter how terrible it may appear. And he says, do not fear, because you cannot kill anyone. No one can kill anyone. No one can prevent death, but no one fails to survive it. On this occasion there is a great struggle, a great conflict. But always remember that certain is death for the living, and certain is birth for the dead. It is all part of the great story of human growth. Growth through struggle and through pain. Individual learning to become kind because they have hurt a great deal. Families that suddenly become aware of family when one is taken away from them. All through this struggle, war is a symbol of the negative aspects of human character. A symbol of the pain and sorrow that comes from the abuse of power, from the misuse of leadership. But all these things must, in the end in peace. And I think in this particular incident, we are very close to our modern position. We are in a world now, a large part of which is already at war. The dogs of war have been loosed upon the land. Cruelties and abominations are taking place in many parts of the earth. How does it happen that a people get into this situation? How does it come about that aggressive leaders, dictators, tyrants are able to lead their people to self-destruction? The only answer is the people do not understand, do not know, do not have the courage or the position and power to prevent these catastrophes. But Krishna points out in this poem, this great religious poem, that everyone who is alive today, or nearly everyone, will have finished their life here by the end of 100 years. In 100 years, natural causes take away everything. In 100 years, this whole pattern is changed, but there is still a pattern. But what happens to those who have disappeared? What happens to those who are no longer with us? Have they ceased? Are they really gone? Are they really dead? Western materialism is not very helpful in this particular situation. But the quiet soul in meditation begins to think about these things. And it suddenly comes to our minds that there must be a bigger pattern in which these things come to be more righteously adjusted.
All right, let's pause here real quick and just recap. So he's giving the anecdote about the famous scene from the Mahabharata of the or the Bhagavad Gita of Arjuna being visited, having sort of spiritual vision and being visited by Krishna the spiritual being of Krishna. And what he is sort of taught is to put the current situation in a larger perspective. And the way I sort of interpret it, to sort of draw on Jung's psychology, is that there's one self and many selves. And we sort of carry the cross of that one self by playing out a sort of destiny in this world of many selves. And this world of selves recycles itself every 100 or so years, as he was saying. And so the larger meaning and purpose of our lives, which are destined to end, everybody here on Earth one day, is to sort of fulfill a need of that oneself. And so in times of war, what's happening is that the one self is going through a sort of like painful initiation or a painful growth conflict within itself. And that conflict is manifest as the many selves going at war and destroying each other. So that's kind of the gist of it, is the need for a larger perspective is to establish the unity behind the diversity. And in doing so, we not only are able to cope more with disaster, but actually that realization of the unity behind diversity is the very thing that can lead the self to attain the growth that attain the evolutionary growth that it is destined to achieve, because it is the unity, but its consciousness gets subsumed into the diversity as a sort of deliberate meditation exercise, I guess you could say, a divine meditation. And the destiny of that meditation is for it to experience the all the things that come along with individuality and the ignorances and the good and the bad, but eventually the perfection comes within the self as it reawakens to its own divine unity. So coming up here, he's going to make an interesting point, because right now we were talking about war on the battlefield, but then he transitions and talks about, there is terrible things that also happen during times of peace. And he talks about, the sort of like unrestrained capitalism. And you might look at what today's war as being a war and not in a time of peace. Now, that's not true. In a lot of parts of the world, there is active conflict and starvation and things going on. But at least in the Western countries, in America and Europe and Australia and places like that, it's a time of peace, but yet the social conflict is intense. And so he's going to comment some on that and then take things further.
We must come to realize the fact that some will last here longer than others, but those who live and those who do not live must both pass through pain. Some feel that the battlefield is a terrible place, and it is. But the battlefield in peace is also a terrible place. The battle of ambitions, of competition, the battle of capitalism versus socialism, the great battles of faith, the magnificent struggle of the human being, all this is part of a strange pattern. We have to get back to some values, some pattern, some reason, some purpose, which makes these things part of a divine plan. If we cannot do this, we cannot face them. Therefore, we must realize, as Krishna said, that certain is death for the living and certain is birth for the dead. And out of all of this comes a recognition of one of the great laws of Indian thinking, and that is the law of reincarnation. We must realize that we live in a universe in which everything is alive forever, that appearances change, that things seem to go away and some seem to come back. The little child opens its eyes into this world, and the aged person goes to sleep at the end of a long and busy life. But these things are incidents in the unfoldment of eternal powers, principles, and lives. The individual who comes into this world was not new when he came. The one who leaves here does not vanish forever and disappear simply because he drops a body that is too old and too tired. As a man casteth off worn-out garments and taketh others that are new, so the Spirit casteth off worn-out bodies and taketh others that are new. Never the Spirit was born. The Spirit shall cease to be never. Birth and death, they are dreams. Life is forever. This is the song of the Bhagavad Gita. And we have to recognize in moments of emergency that it is the power that gives us the courage and the patience to face the difficult realities of life. That we create these realities because we are not strong enough yet to prevent them.
So he makes a really great point here, and something that I think is really underrated, is to emphasize continuously the truth of reincarnation as a foundational concept, and that we should really find a way to integrate that into our psychology and into our worldview, because it's the key to understanding how meaning and purpose in our lives can play out, and how at any given moment in time things can seem difficult, like you can feel trapped in a situation. But to remember reincarnation gives you a couple things. I mean, number one, it puts you on a timeline that is beyond the immediate moment and connects you to an unknown past that stretches deep into antiquity. And it also connects you into a future. And the element that binds all that together is this idea of karma, so that what you're experiencing now is in some way an effect whose causes are in an unknown past, and the way that you handle and react to the situations that you're in set up a sort of karmic pattern for the future. So it positions things such that everything matters, and that's this kind of constructive, idealistic attitude that we need to have to gain the courage to solve the things that we need to solve. And it gives you the courage to sort of speak truth to power and to stand up for things that you believe in, even if it seems uncertain what the payoff is going to be. This idea of reincarnation should give you a grounding in a sort of greater reality that you're participating in, that even though it may not be evident to you at any given point how that reality is playing out, to have a faith that reality, there is a law behind it, and a pattern and a purpose, and you are in some mysterious way a part of that law and a part of that plan. And so the concept of reincarnation is extremely critical to emphasize continuously, and Manly Hall does emphasize it continuously, and that's very important. So now let's move on.
But consider the present situation. We are all today gravely anxious over the world situation. We know that a nuclear holocaust would end all the dreams of the ages. We know all these things perfectly well. We want to do everything we can to prevent these things from happening. And one of these days, we shall become tired of killing ourselves and each other. The light will dawn, and there will come into our lives, into our consciousness, the realization of the dignity of life, the reality of it, the importance of it, and that we are here to protect it and further it and advance it in every way, and not to destroy it. So the Indian classic gives us a certain sense of the fact that we are all passing through lessons of the great pattern of processes, of tests, of trials, and that all the initiation rites of antiquity had within them problems of trial, dangers and hazards that could only be surmounted by the individual who had achieved in his heart a final and perfect union with truth. The individual who really understands life is indestructible. Bodies may come and go, but life is eternal if within ourselves we have come to this realization. And here in the West, we need a little more of the dimension of future than we've had up to the present time. We have had many hundreds of wars in Europe and America. We will probably have some more, God forbid. But then, in all of these changes, we have failed to work a system of understanding of man's place in things. We have failed to take into consideration the probability, at least, that the divine plan that put us here does not intend to wipe us out. That whatever it is that we come with into this life, something is going to go on. Something is going to build upon sacrifice, upon heroism, upon patriotism, upon dedications of all kinds. The dedicated parent has one emergency after another, but there is a reason, there is a reward, there is a purpose, and there is a great good that justifies these struggles that we go through. So it seems very necessary, therefore, to understand more of the circle of life and death in order that we can adjust our consciousness to the inevitables. We all know these inevitables, but we realize so little about them and what they mean to us. Therefore, it is, I think, suitable and proper to bear in mind that we have to have a life concept that is big enough. Now, what happens to our life concept? Well, the fashionable mechanistic theory, the materialism, which we regard as beautifully intelligent, says there's nothing. It simply wipes the individual out generation after generation. The only immortality is the statue in the public park. All the rest is gone. There is nothing that goes on except perhaps a contribution to the future. Perhaps the scientist discovers a cure for some ailment or some commodity to help us improve society. And for these he is remembered, but he is gone. And according to this idea, the entire end of all things is oblivion. Nothing survives. And the only immortality that we have is through progeny. Those who come after us with our blood live something of our lives. They do not know it. We have no reason to suspect that we will know it either. So this is the type of world in which great advancements in material prospects have developed in the last 200 years. This is the world in which we have built a terrific economic empire, which we go about expanding, a great industrialism, a great labor process, tremendous political procedures, the miseries of the stock exchange and high finance. All of these things seemingly are rooted in a condition that exists here. We may make $1 billion, but we can take none of it with us. Not only we can't take any of it with us, we are not going anywhere with or without it, according to the prevailing thought. So we're going to leave this wealth to our descendants, who will probably kill themselves on dissipation with our funds. All of this is what we call life. While we call this life, we are dead, even while we are still alive.
I really love that he goes into this critique of like Western materialism, because this is, for me, the theme that is on trial here in the world. And if we just go back and revisit that idea of the Pluto-Saturn conjunction of January 2020, that was January 2020 is the exact, but I mean, the orb stretches from 2019 actually into this year. But that relationship, planetary relationship, is very tightly themed around death and rebirth. And I think we're seeing a gradual death of this materialistic mind state that he's talking about, this sort of industrial materialism, which the pharmaceutical industry, Western medicine, the sort of like oligarchical class that is sort of like lineages stretches back to the Rockefellers. That whole group is premised around an ideology of this materialistic mind state. And he's saying that, when we value that ideology and that worldview, we're really accepting, we're asleep. It's a form of death. The self is sort of dead, and the world is dying. I mean, not literally dead, but it's a worldview that destroys itself. And it seems as if this is the last gasp of that worldview, because I don't see how it can recover. The world can't afford another 100 years of this. So this seems to be a very critical point. And I really like the point that he makes coming up about the sort of idea that's the sort of like the static spiritual ideas that are, I mean, basically there is no spiritual idea, at least in like pop culture. It's sort of this idea that we're just here to consume and that's it, and there's no need for a larger spiritual or religious concept of life. So he's going to touch on that and just kind of point out the absurdity of the idea that we're just here for a little while and then we die and then we just turn into dust. And it's sort of this pitiful idea of the purpose and meaning of human life. It's sort of this accident. And so anyway, he's going to be talking about that and then moving on.
Nothing is meaningful, nothing is personal, nothing is real. If the curtain goes down and there is not any of us anymore, we simply become part of an undercurrent of earth or air in which other lives will grow, which seems to be a rather pitiful end to the struggle for existence through which we pass. Socrates faced this in his last days when he chose to be executed by the people of Athens rather than to compromise his principles. So with his disciples grieving about him, they all, of course, were very unhappy, very miserable. But Socrates said, "Don't worry about me. Nothing is going to go wrong." He said, "All my life, I wanted to know the answers. I wanted to know more about this world than I can ever see from here." So he said, "I have a conclusion. One of two things is going to happen when I leave here. The first thing that could happen is that there is the end of Socrates. There is nothing more. If that is so, it's going to be a very peaceful oblivion. I'm not going to worry about anything. I have no enemies. I have no problems. I simply am not. The other answer is more interesting, because if I do survive death, I will then be in the presence of the answers to everything that has worried me in this world. If I survive, then I will live where there are answers to questions, where I will understand something more of the divine plan for things, will have a fuller nature and a study of natural law. Either I will vanish utterly, or I will survive to find the answers of questions that I could never find in the mortal world." And he took the poison and died. Well, this is something that we are faced with again, on the assumption that we are not quite willing to admit that we begin with a bit of protoplasm and end with a pinch of ashes, that there's something else. We can say this: all right, supposing after death we do live. Suppose we live in a kind of mysterious world that we know very little about, a summer land of spirits, that we go somewhere into the universe, and there we continue to be, and we continue perhaps even to share with our friends and relatives who have gone before. In some cases, God forbid. But for some cases at least, we would like it that way. We go to some summer land like the Elysian fields of the Egyptian. Life is just a continuance in a gray mystery land, which, according to rewards and punishments, will go on. No punishment, however, is eternal. The individual lives what he has lived here. He may be not even aware, actually, that he is dead, but he is living in a world of internal realities, which perhaps is more important than anything else. Now, there's another possibility in this, namely that when he leaves here, he goes to punishment or reward. Now, in theology, it is rather clear, but the theological explanation is not as well received as it used to be. We are no longer quite concerned with the idea of eternal perdition. We do not feel that a human being, imperfect and incomplete, unfinished already, should go into an eternity of consequences as a result of its actions in this world. We are not supposed to assume that small causes produce great effects. And it is not right to assume that an ignorant person, making mistakes, even committing sins, must be punished forever for this. So that the concept of heaven and hell in the theological thinking is no longer very attractive or very rational or very reasonable. It does nothing to strengthen the individual here. One does not become a good because he fears evil. He is good because he performs as well as he can. So the theory of going on to heaven or hell is not particularly acceptable anymore. It doesn't seem to solve a problem. Why should we go to hell when we're in it here? Plato said men did not go to hell where they die. They come to hell when they're born. This is purgatory. This is the place where individuals must grow, must stand strong and firm, and must pass the tests of mortal life to ensure that they are fulfilling the evolutionary processes of the system of cosmic worlds to which we belong.
So here he makes the point that after talking about how we've, as a sort of like collective, outgrown the need for the sort of like fear of God, the punishment of going to hell if you don't live by the letter of the law, as far as Scripture goes, how we need a more advanced and mature concept of how to live and have our lives guided, that's more inspirational, inspires us to do the best that we can, not because we're afraid of punishment, but because we want to participate in a larger reality. He makes the important point that in esoteric philosophy, this world of separation and division and pain and sorrow and isolation is the underworld. This world where the soul is focused out into the world of matter and into individuality is the condition. This sort of consciousness of separation is the state of mind of being in the underworld. And it's interesting that Pluto, according to Manly Hall, Pluto represents the initiator, and in a way Saturn does as well, but Pluto is sort of the master. And in classical mythology, Pluto rules Hades, the underworld. And so this world that we're in is, and this is something he's about to touch on, this underworld exists as a type of school for souls to sort of be initiated with a baptism by fire and water. And I think we're feeling a bit of the fire at the moment, which is that we, through undergoing these experiences, the conflicts involved, that we grow as souls. And the soul growth is something that's measured in reincarnation and over the course of many, many lives. So let's hear about that.
Now, if we accept the doctrine of rebirth or reincarnation, then we realize what we are. We're in school. We're in school to learn lessons. That our society, the world in which we live, is the great school. As one of the Rosicrucian authors said long ago, we are all ABCdarians in the school of the Holy Spirit. This is a school. This is a school in which various things happen, in various spans between birth and death. But every good deed lives, and every bad deed feeds away. Actually, the marvelous thing is that good works with good wherever you find it. Evil fights evil wherever it appears. One thing or another always happens, but that which builds together is right and helps to make things possible. We must outgrow the problems that now beset us. We can't walk out on them. Peace cannot be legislated while envy and cupidity are in the human heart and conduct. There is no way we can solve the problem of the world dilemma unless we solve in ourselves the weaknesses which cause us to compromise principle. Practically everything we need to consider at the present time, factually, is the Sermon on the Mount and the words of Jesus at the Last Supper. There is the code. There is what we have to learn. And until we learn it, we have to be punished. But this punishment is not eternal damnation. This punishment is not war upon war forever. This punishment is not the continual victory of evil over good or weakness over strength, because each of these reverses forces us to a greater determination to correct our own mistakes. We have to face them. And in the little problems of daily living, the alcoholic has to face his own weaknesses. Everything that goes wrong has got to be straightened out by those who cause it. And as no individual is probably willing to make so supreme an effort quickly, it may take several lifetimes for the individual to get along, working with himself until he solves his own need. It may take 50 lives for an individual to reach a point where he knows what's wrong with war and he knows his part in causing it. When that happens, peace comes. But in nature does not humor. Nature strengthens by forcing resolution. Nature makes us grow. And if there was any way of avoiding it, we would. We've been trying to evade realities since the beginning of history, but we've never avoided one of them yet. They come back again and again until the individual outgrows his own weakness. When this happens, civilization outgrows war.
All right, so here we're going into an idea that we've touched on in a couple earlier lectures, in particular the one that has to do with reincarnation and empire. In that talk, I reviewed 2 different articles of Manly Hall's. And in those, he suggests that every 500 or so years, a wave of souls that are sort of participating in a cycle of empire will come back to sort of rehash karma from the past, but also to learn a new wave of lessons each time until finally these souls can become strong enough to overcome this karmic pattern. And so he's suggesting that souls cluster together because they sort of share a karma of a certain collective pattern that they all participate in. And so what he's saying here sort of suggests that these cycles of war that we see throughout history, that perhaps there's a link between the souls who are participating in these various patterns. It could be the same people coming back, not people, but the same soul sort of desire coming back again and again until it's one day exhausts that fire for those type of ambitions and sort of self-gratifying aims of the people who cause war or the people who fall into participating in war. Eventually this cycle will burn itself out and the souls involved will learn the lessons that they need to learn, in order to eventually have the peace that we all want.
Now, another interesting phase of this problem was presented to us in the dialogues and discourses of Buddha. Among these discourses, there's the story of the great general who was converted to Buddhism. And one day this great general came and asked Buddha the great questions. He said, "Master, I am the generalissimo of the armies of the kingdom. I have sworn to support the ruler and to support the people and to protect the land. Now, if this calls for war, what do I do? You tell me war is wrong. You tell me there should be no war. Yet I am sworn to protect my country if an enemy invades it. What should I do?" And Buddha talked very quietly. He said, "Defend your country." But he said, "Master, this is different from what you said." Buddha said, "No, it isn't. You haven't asked me what it's going to cost you to keep your word. If you are prepared as a true patriot to defend your country, and your country is therefore led by you into war, don't forget that you share the karma of war. You are going to have to pay not only here in the material world, but elsewhere for the karma of killing. There's no avoiding. But if it is in a cause that you consider greater than yourself, it is no worse than dying on a battlefield for the same reason. You are going to have to experience and accept the punishment for having to do wrong. You have voluntarily said you would do it. Now, regardless of anything, you were the leader, and all those who perished under your leadership have their own destiny to fulfill, but there is not one of them that carries the destiny that you do. The person who leads the army or leads the nation to war carries the heavy burden of it and must pay that debt. Those otherwise go to sleep and wake again. But there is not one person who will ever die in your army who is dead. Not one who will ever cease to be, any more than if there had been peace, and in a few years later this individual died from natural causes. But the native who dies for his principles has a good karma also. The hero who serves, who loves, who gives every last moment of life and devotion does not go down to silence, does not go down to darkness, does not go down to death. Everyone who has done their duty as they believed in their heart that duty to be has grown as they could never grow unless they were tested. Each individual is responsible for the morality of his own action. Unselfishness has a great and glorious reward. We can't see it, but the person who has it will know it. And all the way along through these experiences, we are learning the lessons of final peace. We are learning, however, that peace begins not between the generals of the armies, but in our own little family. We have to heal the wounds of strife in our own families, brother against brother, parent against child, child against parent. We have to gradually take on the mature responsibilities of world citizenship, world leadership, world integrities. There is no reason why any individual should believe for a moment that his sacrifice for any good cause is lost, or that the cause, even if it is lost, affects him. And we are celebrating Pearl Harbor Day. But a lot of fine young people died for their country, died unexpectedly and suddenly. How are we going to evaluate this? Are we going to assume that they're all lying in little rows of white crosses? Are we to assume that they've gone from here to nowhere? That for them all is over, and all the blessings of life and all the curses also are no longer for them? And there are some who are still lingering in pain. Are we to understand that all of this is something that cannot be helped? Or is each war a reminder, a tremendous tragic evidence of the failure of peace and what it means? And here within a few years, comparatively, 30, 40 years, since World War II, more wars, more pillage, more dictators striving to control human hearts, a continuation of the great strife, the strife which is the cause of it all. Strife, impatience, aggressiveness, determination to control or destroy, the building up of egos, gold braid, all these things, and a constant fear hanging over. Actually, today, we are in the presence of the greatest test that we have ever faced concerning survival. A survival which depends basically upon accepting the challenge of this great nuclear enemy that hangs over us. We know now that something is going to happen and we can't win. We suddenly realize that we are an alcoholic, we're on the verge of delirium tremens, that we are a narcotic addict who has had all the highs we could have and now is going into the eternal low. We have to realize that all these thousands of years we have temporized with problems. We have tried to do what we wanted to do at the expense not only of each other, but in violation of universal law. Today, the world is largely made up of transgressors of one size or another. Many of these can't do much about it. But there is no one that can't do something about it. And the beginning of that something is to take a completely new position inside yourself as to what is value, and try to live according to a better standard of life.
All right, so earlier there he was talking about that the atomic bomb was the greatest threat. And then we kind of moved beyond that as a world. But today's threat is no less dire, which is sort of like catastrophic environmental destruction, the sort of great poisoning, as Catherine Austin Fitts calls it, the sort of like toxicity epidemic, the whatever sort of like sinister eugenic-esque plans that certain actors in the deep state might be pursuing. These are maybe the things that he would be mentioning today. But then he kind of moves on and talks about the promise of philosophy and the role that philosophy plays in terms of allowing us to integrate ourselves so that we can be constructive vessels or vehicles in order to transmute the situation that we're in. And then next up, he's going to talk about the three great evils: ignorance, superstition, and fear. So this is, again, ignorance, superstition, and fear, I would say, would be the dominant themes in the global response to the epidemic situation in terms of global policy and just like day-to-day how people and businesses are reacting in this sort of hysterical manner. So let's hear what he has to say.
In the last 65 years in which I've been working in these problems, hundreds, perhaps thousands, have brought their problems to me. Most of these problems involve a kind of spiritual ignorance, the inability to understand the reason for things, a bewilderment, but not an understanding and not a sense of essential value. These people have brought their problems, and all these problems have come to stand for ignorance, superstition, or fear. Well, how can we be a great civilized people and remain morally ignorant? How can we claim to be an educated people when we cannot control our own lives? How does it happen that we can think of success in the terms of income and pay no attention to the tragedy that this success is causing? We are faced with a greater and greater stress. The population of the earth is increasing. In the years that lie ahead, maybe the next 100 years, we cannot continue the system of constant financing of things. We cannot build upon natural resources that are becoming more and more depleted. How does it happen that a civilized, educated people can go on creating nuclear waste, doing all these things with a good spirit, or trying to find some place to bury it, without realizing that 50 years from now someone may have to build a house on that place and will die from the waste? How do we go from day to day with this type of thinking? It is because, for some unknown reason, which isn't really justified, we have carefully ignored the wisdom that we have inherited from the natural past. We have ignored the words and thoughts of the great world teachers. We quote them, but we do not live them. We quote Plato when he tells us that any form of government is good if the governor is good, and no form of government is good if the governor is bad. And there's no way of compromising this, but we don't pay much attention to it. We can also learn that in this world there is not a sufficient supply of anything to permit everyone to be rich. As long as this remains unsolved, we're going to have confusion, crime, rebellion, because we are not cooperating in the use of what we have, but striving desperately to get hold of a little more at someone else's expense. All these things lead to trouble. And in the presence of the great trouble that is gathering now, we are going to be called upon to solve these problems ourselves. How do we solve them? We solve them perhaps in the terms that each one of us has within his own nature a teacher. There is something we call the soul. There is a guidance from within, a guidance that seems to have come to us with that spark of divine life by which we are able to live. And the spark of life in us, the God in us, is also the great teacher.
So here we're kind of revisiting this idea that I talked about earlier, that there are many selves but one self. And at the apex of each person's inner life, their apex of their psyche is this self that we all share in common, and we each have a unique angle into that self. And kind of going into the idea of reincarnation, there's this idea that each of us has a spiritual soul and then an animal soul. And the animal soul is the one that's occupying the body. It's the one that becomes the personality. But the spiritual soul is the one that never goes into the illusion of individuality. So the spiritual soul is the one that is outside of creation and is the link that each of us has to the self, and is an aspect of the self. That's the one that reincarnates, and it reincarnates by projecting these the lesser self or the animal soul, life after life. So that's the sinner, and then over, they say, 800 different lives, it will have 800 different extensions of itself come out, and through those extensions, it experiences the things it needs to experience to gradually attain the awakening that it needs to attain to accomplish its sort of ends that it's set out for itself at the very beginning of the creative activity that the self went into when it entered into its active mode and in this creative mode when the sort of like birth of our cycle of existence began. So that's the sort of context in which he's discussing this situation.
If we can gradually come to terms with our own inner lives, if we can discover the Sermon on the Mount as it is repeated in our own hearts, and it is every day, and accept it, if we can learn to keep the Ten Commandments joyously, we can do tremendous things. Now, some of these things might and will require sacrifice. And I think in this term of Pearl Harbor, this day, we kind of owe it to those who died without fully understanding, leaving behind everything they held dear and cherished. Let us try, as Lincoln said at Gettysburg, to prove that these shall not die in vain. That we're not just going to wait until another call comes and we'll all rush to the flag and it'll all go over again. Let us really try to do something to help these situations. Let's start trying to create in education something that fits young people for a better life than merely computerization. Let us recognize that education is helping a person to live, not teaching him simply to make a career. That we must build careers around integrity so they will contribute to the common menace. We have to do things better, and education is supposed to help us to do this. Education is supposed to make an individual safe for himself and safe for those around him. Instead of that, he is unsafe and he is a menace to everyone else. We must finally put the soul and spirit of truth into our affairs. The soul must must control and direct the works that we are doing every day. There has to be beauty. There has to be love. There has to be faith. We cannot continually pollute our world with the selfishness and negation. Consider the entertainment field. Consider the arts, the sciences. All these different levels of human aspiration, nearly all of them corrected for physical gain. The commercializing of existence. You can't make it that way.
So he's really touching on some points here that are really relevant. Particularly when he's talking about we should be getting knowledge when we go to school that makes us safe citizens of the world, and instead we're sort of indoctrinated into this concept of like absolute materialism and sort of like spiritual nihilism that sets us up for this very egocentric view of the world that is also misinformed in terms of the basic sort of like laws of nature and laws of life that we must follow if we're to not only be safe citizens of the world, but if we're to be healthy and productive members of our community. Sort of instead, we're taught a doctrine that is like intended. It's almost like a training program to enter this like very sick corporate and like governmental massive bureaucracy where you just are kind of fit into this highly compartmentalized role, and you can't see the forest for the trees in terms of how the overall system works, and you're just sort of like mindlessly doing this little chipping away at this little piece of a machine that's terribly sick, and so he's really kind of speaking truth to power about that whole system and the sort of like existential flaws, not more than flaws, but just sort of the meaninglessness of the whole thing. So I really love that clip. I mean, if you think about this, he probably did this lecture 30 to 40 years ago, and or actually he died 30 years ago. So this is probably like, I don't know, 40 or 50. And, you know, the fact that we never corrected any of the things that he's talking about is sort of like all those things sort of karmically have come to a head at this point in time, where you have this health catastrophe, environmental catastrophe, human rights catastrophes all over the world. And it's sort of like now we're being forced, I think we're going to be forced to have an awakening, but in this very ugly way. And who knows, how intense and dark things will get before that awakening is sort of forced on people. But I think the awakening will have to sort of rudely be forced on us, because we kicked the can down the road as a collective for such a long time. So yeah, this is just a great passage from Manly Hall.
So if we keep on this way, we're going to have more trouble. But there is no reason why we have to remain this way. The voice of the people is the voice of God. And if the individual stands for his principles, tyranny cannot survive. If the individual becomes a friend or other individuals, he's not going to war against them. He is not going to be picked up in this power conflict, which ends is a very simple fact. All of these paths of glory end but in the grave. Each person going out of here should be richer than when he comes in. Not richer in money, but a better human being. We have anywhere from 50 to 80 or 90 or maybe 100 years of schooling here. And when we leave this school, we should graduate and not be thrown out. We should be graduated into the next class. We should have our own little graduation ceremony with gown and mortarboard hat if necessary. But when we leave here, we should be better human beings than when we came here. And if we kept up that pattern gradually, we would end in a world of peace. We would have More's utopia in fact and substance. And there's no reason why we should not be better. It is very important that the true and honorable person does not die in vain. We should, for the sake of those who died at Gettysburg, those who died in Europe in World War I, those who died in World War II, to save a free world. This free world is therefore privileged to use these years as a means of growing and deserving freedom. Freedom is something that you can't have if you're in slavery to your own weaknesses. So these years of opportunity and privilege, this nation founded on sacrifice, this nation that has fought its way to a place to which millions of troubled and privated people have come. A world here that is more or less represented by the Statue of Liberty in the harbor. A world of privilege and opportunity, the answer to prayer. William Penn bringing his Quakers, trying to find peace, trying to find right to worship. When we are now taking the right to worship as a privilege to not worship anything. This all is a mistake. The powers that be gave us all a beautiful garden in which we could build a world. And it's going to continue to be as it is until we grow up. We are all here to learn as long as we live. And learning means to learn how to live, not merely learn how to pay bills, but to learn how to have a real life. We're here to grow by learning every day values that help us to become better people and help other people to unfold their potentials. There's a story of an old Greek scholar who was lying in the back room of his little house, and he was on his deathbed. And the relatives and friends were grouped in the front room waiting to perform the last services for him. And they got into the usual problem. They began gossiping about the neighbors. They talked about politics. They talked about the sports. They talked about everything while they were just waiting for this old gentleman to pass on. Finally, someone looked into the room and saw him sitting up halfway in bed with his hand clapped behind his ear like this. And one of them said, "But grandfather, what are you doing? You're not interested in these things anymore. You're about to leave us." And the old gentleman said, yes, I'm about to leave you. But as long as I'm here, I can still learn something. Now, this is what we all have to do. We all have to start learning things. Learning to be better friends. Learning to do nicer and more kindly deeds. Learning to turn in a full day's work if we're paid for it. Learning to make proper use. And also not tempting ourselves and each other into expenditures and extravagances which endanger the future of the system. We are just living in a kind of a whirlwind of quick profits, actually as though this was the last chance, and that we have to make it now or not at all. This isn't the last chance. The chances go on until we make it right. And that little by little we must transform this material world into an enlightened system of education. It is a kind of alchemical laboratory where we must learn the secrets of the universal medicine and also of the universal truths of existence. It is here that religion must come of age, must become the leader of the important changes that must come in human character. Here faiths have to realize that while there are 72 names of God, there's only one God. And all this fighting over the deities and all the religious confusion that we have is essentially an ulterior motive problem. The religion is being used as a means of assisting dictators to control ignorant people. This is no good either. But religion, as it should be, is an essential part of the civilizing of the human being. We must come back to the fundamental values of life. We have the knowledge. There's no way of denying the fact that we know better than we do. We know what it means to love one another. We know what it means to keep the faith and keep the truth. We know that only as individuals we do these things that nations become great and nations become good. We are all of us part of one little pattern of dedicated life going to school on a little planet in space. We were not created to become masters of each other. We were created to become friends, to be one purpose, to preserve this world in which we live. We can restore it so that it can perpetuate us for an indefinite period of time, or we can destroy it to the degree that it will not sustain the life we know for another century. All of these things are in our hands. And whenever we get in the mood to be grateful for something, we should be grateful to the power that has given us the right and the means to be great, to be good, to be loving, wise, and friendly people. We must and should be grateful for wisdom within ourselves, faculties, skills, and abilities by which we can transcend the commonplace, the means within ourselves to solve our own ignorance and to create out of our mistakes a virtue that is going to endure forever. We have to shift the leadership to that which is and always was the true leader, and that is the divine life within ourselves, the light of God that shines through our eyes the day we're born, the light of truth that is around us in the summer and the birds and all the beautiful things of life. We've got to bring them back and make them real in our lives. We've got to have a beautiful world, a world of people who love to grow, a world of people who love to serve each other. And if we can build this back to where it should be, or up to what it must be, we will find this a very pleasant world to live in. And as a byproduct, let's remember, as I think Dr. Randall would probably like to point out, that when these sums are accomplished, there will be a major change in the health patterns of humanity. We will not all be neurotics. We will not all be falling under the despairs and sorrows of a generation. We will not have nearly as many ulcers. The physical body cannot stand wrong management any more than the world can. And as long as we live with sick attitudes, the world will be sick. But when we finally wake up to the facts of life, as been pointed out already, it is quite possible that we will have very little disease. Disease is from dis-ease, and we all have that. But we can get over it. And we can have instead bodies comparatively healthy for a long time, because we do not destroy them in useless competition or break them up with fears, anxieties, and miseries. So the psychology of the matter is that you can't have a sick world and healthy people. Therefore, the time has come to create individual health by working together to create a world in which health is possible, as the healthy world will support healthy people, and vice versa. But while we live in constant anxiety and fear, the only people who really succeed in achieving something really out of our misery are the physicians. They are the ones who we need because we are breaking the rules.
So I was kind of letting things ride there, but I mean, how about that message and how apropos to our current situation, in which the ugliness of the world system is reflected within the physical and mental sort of health crises that are dominating the world, and particularly the Western world. And I think this the lockdowns, the coronavirus, I mean, the mental health thing is real. Like, everybody I know is struggling in one way or another with some sort of mental health crisis, or acute episode, or has, at least in the past year and a half. And yeah, I mean, we live in an ugly world, and we have an ugly society, and so that's reflected in the physical illness, the chronic illness, and the mental health illness that you see all around us. So I love how appropriate that is. So I'm going to let things ride out here towards the conclusion, and then just end it. So thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate it, and check back soon. Thank you.
So at this time, let's see, before we have to have another Pearl Harbor, that we can make it unnecessary. That when the time comes, we'll stand together for things that are right. And in standing together for these right things, we can be true to the millions who have died to give us hope. Whole civilizations have been wiped out, trying to be true to principles and truths. One time after another, ulterior motives have taken over. We see the Crusades, where for over 300 years Europe became practically depopulated. We find the wars between religions. We find the fight that is now being done between the various religions of Asia. All of these things in the name of truth, and every one of them a monument to falsehood. There is no need for these things. There is no need for anything of this kind. All of these things happen every day. It's time to stop having them happen. If we can stop these things and put the faiths themselves back in their relationship to each other, which they were intended to have, we'll have religious unity. And if we can get the religions together, it will be a large part of the reforming of human society. So let each of us take a little job, do what we can, work on it a bit, and see if we can't do something every day as in memory of those who have died for us, and in hope for those who will be born from us to better times that lie ahead. Well, I guess that's it for the morning.